Medium white Arctic snow martin.
Small white Arctic.
Tiny silver polar Arctic fox.
Tiny silver polar Arctic moose. Medium silver Arctic mountain goat. Medium snowy Arctic reindeer. Medium white Arctic wolf. Giant gray polar bear. Large white polar marmot. Medium white Arctic wolf. Giant gray Arctic reindeer. Medium snowy polar reindeer. Small silver polar marmot. Large white polar bison. Large white Arctic yak. Giant gray Arctic wolverine. Small white polar bear. Medium white polar musk ox. Tiny snowy polar marmot. Giant snowy Arctic wolverine. Tiny gray Arctic polar bison. Large snowy Arctic wolverine. Small snowy polar pika. Tiny white Arctic ice weasel. Medium white polar lemming. Large snowy Arctic lemming.
Tiny silver polar snow martin.
Medium snowy Arctic marmot.
Small silver Arctic muskox. Large frosted Arctic wolf. Giant frosted Arctic ibex. Large gray polar Arctic moose.
Medium white Arctic ibex.
Large white Arctic pika. Medium snowy polar reindeer.
Medium gray polar lemming. Tiny frosted Arctic lemming.
Tiny white polar Arctic moose. Medium white polar glacier lynx. Medium gray polar reindeer. Large white polar bear. Small snowy polar snow leopard. Large snowy Arctic wolverine. Giant snowy Arctic lemming. Medium silver Arctic snow marten. Large snowy polar wolverine. Medium silver Arctic ice weasel. Giant silver Arctic wolverine.
Tiny snowy Arctic mountain goat.
Tiny snowy Arctic hare.
Giant snowy polar glacier lynx. Small white Arctic snow marten. Large white polar Arctic hare. Medium snowy polar marmot. Giant snowy polar lemming.
Giant frosted Arctic pika.
Large snowy polar muskox. Giant snowy Arctic polar bear. Large snowy polar pika. Tiny gray polar Arctic fox. Giant frosted Arctic reindeer. Tiny gray Arctic lemming.
Tiny silver polar Arctic hare.
Medium white Arctic polar bison. Giant snowy Arctic polar bear. Giant gray polar wolverine.
Small snowy polar pika.
Giant snowy polar reindeer. Medium gray polar ice weasel. Small white Arctic ice weasel. Giant icy Arctic snow marten.
Giant silver Arctic marmot.
Medium snowy polar reindeer.
Large snowy Arctic ice weasel.
Tiny snowy polar bison.
Large white polar pika. Medium white polar ice weasel. Medium white polar musk ox. Medium white Arctic wolverine. Giant snowy polar reindeer. Medium gray polar marmot. Small silver Arctic muskox.
Giant icy Arctic polar bear.
Large icy Arctic fox. Large gray Arctic fox. Medium white polar reindeer. Tiny frosted Arctic wolverine. Giant icy Arctic yak.
Tiny snowy polar wolverine. Tiny snowy Arctic fox.
Medium white Arctic muskox. Giant icy Arctic marmot. Tiny silver Arctic yak.
Tiny snowy Arctic wolf.
Medium snowy Arctic lemming. Medium silver Arctic reindeer.
Giant icy Arctic polar bison.
Tiny snowy polar musk ox. Medium snowy Arctic mountain goat. Large icy Arctic wolf.
Tiny snowy Arctic wolf.
Large snowy Arctic muskox. Giant frosted Arctic polar bear. Large white polar reindeer. Medium snowy polar musk ox. Giant gray Arctic wolf. Medium white Arctic musk ox. Small silver polar ibex.
Giant silver Arctic lemming.
Medium snowy polar marmot. Large snowy polar mountain goat.
Giant icy Arctic ibex.
Medium silver Arctic caribou. Tiny silver Arctic polar bear. Medium white Arctic polar bison.
Tiny frosted Arctic yak.
Large snowy polar Arctic moose.
Large white polar glacier lynx.
Tiny silver Arctic yak. Medium snowy polar Arctic moose.
Medium gray Arctic mountain goat.
Medium snowy polar musk ox. Large silver Arctic pika. Medium white polar snow leopard. Large white polar bison. Giant icy Arctic ibex. Large white Arctic snow marten.
Giant icy Arctic ibex.
Giant white polar lemming.
Medium snowy Arctic marmot.
Tiny silver Arctic ice weasel.
Tiny silver polar pika. Small silver Arctal wolverine. Giant silver Arctic fox. Small silver polar Arctic moose. Medium white Arctic marmot. Tiny frosted Arctic wolverine.
Large snowy polar caribou.
Tiny silver polar bison. Small snowy polar pika.
Tiny snowy Arctic glacier lynx.
Giant snowy Arctic snow marten.
Large, snowy polar Arctic fox. Small frosted Arctic ibex.
Tiny silver polar Arctic wolf.
Small, snowy polar snow martin.
Giant frosted Arctic lemming.
Giant gray Arctic caribou.
Tiny white polar bison.
Giant snowy polar Arctic moose. Tiny snowy polar caribou.
Small, snowy polar reindeer.
Giant white polar bison. Giant snowy polar Arctic fox. Giant gray polar wolverine. Giant snowy polar Arctic wolf. Medium white polar yak. Tiny snowy polar reindeer. Tiny icy Arctic wolverine. Large icy Arctic polar bear. Giant frosted Arctic lemming.
Medium silver Arctic wolf.
Large snowy Arctic lemming. Small white Arctic polar bison.
Small silver Arctic hare.
Medium white Arctic lemming. Large gray polar mountain goat.
Tiny snowy polar marmot.
Tiny icy Arctic ice weasel. Large gray polar Arctic moose.
Medium gray polar bear.
Large white polar reindeer. Large white polar bear. Large snowy polar Arctic moose. Giant white polar bison.
Tiny snowy Arctic ibex.
Large white polar bison. Medium snowy Arctic wolf. Small white Arctic ibex. Large snowy Arctic polar bison. Small gray polar ibex. Small snowy Arctic wolverine.
Tiny silver Arctic pika. Medium gray Arctic musk ox.
Medium snowy Arctic wolverine.
Tiny snowy polar glacier lynx. Small silver Arctic mountain goat.
Medium white Arctic snow leopard.
Giant silver Arctic glacier lynx. Small silver polar marmot.
Giant snowy polar Arctic hare.
Medium white polar yak. Large white polar wolverine. Medium silver Arctic glacier lynx. Large white polar yak. Giant snowy Arctic mountain goat.
Tiny silver polar bear.
Tiny snowy Arctic polar bison. Giant snowy Arctic ibex. Small silver Arctic mountain goat. Small silver polar Arctic moose. Small white Arctic polar bear. Large gray polar Arctic wolf. Large gray polar ibex. Giant icy Arctic snow marten. Small white Arctic polar bear. Giant snowy polar musk ox.
Small snowy polar bear.
Small snowy polar musk ox.